that if I were one of the targets, I would immediately think, okay, well, these two things just don't go together, and I would go after the assessment principle. Right? And you can do that in various ways. One thing you might say that this relationship is perhaps a bit too simplistic, and look for other, say, Bayesian measures of conformation. But actually, in this particular respect, they all would have the same problem. They would all raise the same problem, at least the ones that I know. And as a matter of fact, you know, I would say that, you know, just like this one, technically interesting, but no practical use. Okay, so I would think that probably the most likely way to respond to Rick would be to say, what you're taking for granted about the conformation relationship, that just is sort of newfangled logic mongering, that we should just think about it in very traditional epistemological terms. However, the next part of what I want to say, as I see it, the core assumption is no better off if you do that. Because the core assumption by itself, I think, is going to suffer equally and for much the same reasons, no matter what your approach is to the assessment of evidence. And he gave some examples. I want to reinforce it because I think there's a general moral we can draw. So the example I want to just give briefly is the development of the atomic theory in the 19th century. Not anything technical about it. It's a simple story, but it brings out the point very well, I think. So it was proposed by John Dalton in chemistry at the beginning of the 1800s, 1808 about. And he could show that it fit a number of phenomena, explained in terms of the hypothesis that the substances have atomic and molecular structure, and that the molecules are built of atoms and so on. A very simple, straightforward theory. He added a few guesses that people didn't take serious, but he could certainly claim that it, you know, fit these facts that he took to be well attested. Other scientists were not in the least bit happy with it or satisfied with it. That's just what he could show there, that it fit what they knew, just didn't count well enough to make it seriously to take up, but rather it raised the problems that the main quantities, the important parameters in his theory couldn't be measured. There was nothing in the theory to suggest how you could go about measuring, for example, the molecular masses or the mass ratios of the different kinds of atoms. And so, not being able to make the measurements, you also couldn't gather any relevant evidence for it. What happened in the next 100 years between Dalton and Perrin, from 1808 to 1908, is that step by step, these scientists added hypotheses to the core. So first one, Avogadro, right? But the others, you know, famous examples, Boltzmann, Maxwell, Hertz, and so on. Each of them is adding more to the theory so as to make it possible to design procedures to measure the quantities that the theory is talking about. And not being able to design something like that, you can't do any experiments or gather any relevant evidence. Now, maybe there's something a little paradoxical about it, as Rick was suggesting. As you add to the theory, anytime you add something significant, you make it less likely to be true. There are more ways for it to be wrong, right? So in this progression, you get less and less theories that are less and less likely to be true. But the problem from the point of view of evidence is that for the early ones, it's impossible to have evidence. The theory has to be informative enough to allow the design of a measurement procedure, of a procedure which, according to the theory, tells you the values of the quantities. And it's only when you have that much information in your theory that there can be relevant evidence at all. So there is no evidential support for the core. Lots of evidential support for the much less, you know, impersonally speaking, much less likely theory at the end. And I take it that that's very similar to what Rick was saying, using his probabilistic idea. For the very same reason, the core assumption just doesn't seem to work. Okay. Now, the probabilistic assumption, as I said, I divide it into two parts. One is about what the probabilities are. Now, maybe if we reject the assessment principle, is there still a role for probabilities? Yes, of course there is. I mean, however we are going to assess the bearing of evidence on a theory, there's going to be a role for probabilities, right? So it is still an important question to ask, whatever the right way is to assess the bearing of evidence, what the probabilities are that are being appealed to here. The probabilistic assumption that Rick finds in the literature in philosophy, excuse me, is it not loud enough? Or I see some of you doing this. No? It's okay? It's not loud enough. Ah. Can we turn this up? Do you know how to do it?
I don't think it can be turned up from down.
Just put the mic farther up.
Put the mic further up. Ah. Is this a bit better? No. Is this working at all? Here's not a possibility. If I speak like this. Okay, what part did you miss? Okay. So the probabilistic assumption then, the first part is that the probabilities in question are logical, objective probabilities. Now, I certainly, anybody can understand the desire to have something like that, an independent, impersonal arbiter for our judgment. It would give us, if it was there, it would give us a certain kind of security. In fact, it would sort of take the responsibility off our shoulders for good judgment. But Rick's main argument about it, I think, is exactly right, which is that the problem of access. I mean, if we have no access to it, how can it play a role in our deliberations about the bearing of evidence? Now, as he gives it, it is logical probability, which by definition is accessible to reason alone. Fine, okay, but it doesn't follow that we have access. I mean, think for a moment about the mathematics and logic that was developed after 1800. The people before 1800, right, trying to be rational, have no access to it, even though, of course, it is something that is accessible by reason alone. The fact that it's accessible by reason alone doesn't mean that we have access. So if these objective probabilities are in the same boat as futuristic mathematics, for example, then they are certainly not going to play a role in our rational management of our opinion. So again, all I can say is something that, I support the argument that Rick is giving here. But this brings us to what is to me the most interesting part of the paper under the heading of the principle of rationality. And let me just read this, quoting from him. No, not quite a quote, almost a quote. The rationality of holding a belief is highly dependent on the assessment of the bearing of evidence on the belief. Well, yeah, I mean, who could doubt that? I mean, obviously. But in order to see what it implies, well, first of all, we'd have to have started an idea about what evidence is, right? I mean, how much constraint does this put on our rational management of our opinion? The fact that it is that it will be highly dependent on the assessment of the bearing of the evidence on it. Okay, what's evidence? So maybe one of the most extreme views is Timothy Williamson's, who says that our evidence is all and only what we know. One of these days we're going to have a television show where the detective comes to the DA and says, we have to charge this man with murder. What's your evidence? It's all and only what I know, right? Doesn't sound very useful somehow. But I think that Williamson must be at least half right. You couldn't very well say, this is my evidence, but I don't know whether it's true, right? And I think probably in addition, we would have to say the concept of evidence, evidence plays a certain role in dialogue and disputation, so it must be public. I would say at least those two things about what should be called evidence, something that is known and something that is public.